Good afternoon, national readers, and a big warm welcome to our post-budget podcast this afternoon. And who better to discuss the UK budget with than Professor Richard Murphy, a political economist and chartered accountant. Welcome to the podcast, Richard.
Hello and welcome to me and to you, and thanks for being here. I got that one all wrong. Let's do better than that from here on.
No, thank you so much for being with us, Richard. It's great to have you online with us to chat through some of the headlines of yesterday. Before we get into any talk about the detail of the budget, I think we need to discuss what happened before it. And that was the details got leaked half an hour before Rachel Reeves was even due to speak by, ironically, the Office for Budget Responsibility. This is a bit of a you had one job situation, isn't it, Richard?
Look, actually, I would like to go back slightly further than that when we talk about what happened before the budget, because there were a whole series of cock-ups before we got to the point where the OBR managed to splatter it all over their website, probably an hour and a half before they were meant to. She tried out so many different ideas. She got so many of them wrong. She did U-turns before she'd even announced policies. And then, as you say, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the supposed independent agency who checks whether the Treasury's figures are right, managed to publish the whole damn thing. And I was reading it during the course of Prime Minister's questions yesterday. So it changed the whole dynamic of the day. That actually might be good news. Maybe it says that this whole spectacle of the budget should be consigned to history because we could do it better, and they've shown we could do it better. But let's just talk about that Office for Budget Responsibility, because they were created by George Osborne in 2010. They have enormous power. They were the people whose numbers she was trying to prove that she could balance. But they're not independent. The last time I visited the Chancellor's office, and I haven't been invited for a bit, but I have been there, I promise you. The Office for Budget Responsibility were situated a few doors down on the same floor as the Chancellor. They share the same coffee machine. They share the same loos, if they're of the same gender. And I don't think they've got single gender loos as yet in the Treasury. And so this is, first of all, not independent. And secondly, it was basically like the Treasury leaking its own homework. Was that deliberate? Was that a mistake? I'm inclined to believe it was a mistake, but I do think it will change the dynamic in the future. But when Rachel Reeves is trying to claim she's in charge of the economy and she can't even keep the people on the same floor as her in the same building that she works under control, it isn't a good optic, is it?
It is absolutely maddening what happened, completely insane. But I think you were talking there about a number of things that actually got out to the press, and then things changed along the way before we even heard the budget yesterday. One of those things was about income tax, and I do think that this is one of the top things to talk about from the budget, and I'm sure you'll have a lot to say on this, Richard. So Rachel Reeves froze the personal allowance. I believe it's frozen until 2031. You can correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I think I'm
It's frozen until 2031. Yes, it is. Rishi Sunak introduced this freeze in 2021. Let's blame the villain who started the process. I mean, Rachel Reeves is continuing it, but he was the baddie at the start. And I do like blaming things on Rishi Sunak still, because he has a lot of things to be responsible for. And it's been frozen for a decade. And it's totally unjust because it hits those on lowest levels of income the most. Let's be clear. In the next year, this is going to cost people £100 if they're just on the cusp of paying tax or not. And is that fair? No, of course it isn't.
No, it's not fair. And that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, Richard. This is a sort of stealthy way of, it's a stealthy tax rise for low-income people, isn't it? And can you take us through how that works and how that's going to impact those people?
Well, the impact is going to be pretty significant. It is a tax rise right across the range, by the way. It obviously has greatest proportional impact, in my opinion, on those who have the lowest level of income. The basic personal allowance at the moment is £12,570 a year. There is no logic to that number. Do not try to work out why it is that number, because you will not come up with a rational answer. And it has been fixed since 2021. and it has not gone up, but obviously inflation since then has been quite significant. It should now be around £16,000 at least if it had gone up in line with inflation, as I believe it should have done. And as a consequence, people are now paying tax on over £3,000 of income per annum, if they've got income per annum, that they shouldn't be. And if you look at that being a 20% tax rate on over £3,000, people are now already paying over £600 a year that I don't think should be subject to tax. And this has a massive impact when your income is very low. It also has an impact at around the point where you begin to pay 40% tax, which is, if I remember rightly, £50,240. It might be 270. I can't remember whether it's 240 or 270, but just over 50,000. And in 2021, a couple of million or so people were paying higher rate tax. By the time we get to 2031, 4.5 million or more will be paying higher rate tax. So there will be a lot more people who will be paying tax at 40% who shouldn't have been. And 50,000 is a good income, but it's not that spectacularly good that people should necessarily be dragged into higher rates of tax at that level of income at present. This is now a senior teacher, a senior nurse, and mid-grade manager. It's well above average wage, let's be clear. But it isn't, I think, justification for paying higher rate tax. You're not wealthy on that. And there's also, of course, the bands where you go to 45%, 125,000, just over 125,400. That's also fixed. I haven't got a particular problem with that one. In fact, I bring that one down. I probably bring that one down to 100,000, but that's a different story altogether. But the point is that this is what is called fiscal drag. And as a consequence of this, Rachel Reeves might be raising over £7 billion of extra tax a year. And that's a sneaky way to raise taxes. And taxes shouldn't be sneaky. Taxes should be open, transparent, honest. And this is not representation of that. And to me, that's a failure of the relationship of trust that should exist between the government and people. And I know a lot of people in Scotland have problems with the relationship of trust with anything to do with Westminster. And this is just indication of why that should be the case. If Scotland is going to run its tax system better than this in the future, it's got to be very much more accountable than Rachel Reeves and her Treasury are.
And I was just going to ask you, Richard, if you could explain how this impacts people in Scotland, or is likely to, because as we know, income tax is partly devolved to Scotland, but personal allowance is something that is still controlled by the UK government. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this might impact on people in Scotland.
Well, there was potentially going to be an enormous problem as a result of this plan to increase income tax rates in England by 2%. Because the Scottish devolved tax rates would actually have been heavily impacted and basically made null and void if England was going to raise its rates to the level that were going to be applied in Scotland on work. Let me be clear, on work. Because not only does Scotland not have control of the personal allowance, it also doesn't have control of tax rates paid on investment income. And that is, by the way, going up to 22%, unless it's dividends where it's going up to some technically smaller sum of money. So there is going to be an impact there. The interaction is, in a sense, proving just how difficult this relationship is. I wrote an article about this in the last week in the National, and said, frankly, this is one of the reasons why Scotland should have more powers devolved to it, and England should butt out of Scotland's tax affairs, because Scotland does need control over income tax in full. It needs control over corporation tax, which undermines the Scottish income tax system. It needs control over VAT. It needs control over income, capital gains tax and inheritance tax, as well as allowances, because they also have a big impact too. So the discussion about whether you should get tax relief on pension contributions and at what rate and so on should be something Scotland should decide. And we did see the Fraser of Allender Institute raise a paper when Rachel Reeves proposed this 2% increase in income tax across the board 2 or 3 weeks ago, and then reversed. And the Fraser of Allender, in their own unique style, were, in a sense, delighted about the problems this would create for devolved government in Scotland. I'm not the Frasers, let's be honest, greatest fan because of their attitude towards the union. So I lay that on the table. But I do think that what we're seeing is the clear indication that because of the difficulties that this interaction is now creating, the devolution settlement has to be revisited. I put that in my alternative budget, by the way. You can download my alternative budget from my website, Funding the Future. 64 pages of radical alternative to Rachel Reeves, and it's free, just in case you want to know. But that in there, I talked about the fact that we do need to improve at least the devolution settlement now. If England doesn't want to let Scotland go, and there are all the signs that it doesn't, then at the very least, it's got to solve the problems with what was created in 2014, which are hopelessly inadequate for economic management for Scotland. I mean, I feel sorry for anyone in Holyrood in a sense. I mean, they want the job, and so I don't feel totally sorry for them. They know what the constraints are. But the fact is that this is not working for tax for Scotland, and we do need to have a better tax system for Scotland. And the rules we've got are penal with regard to income tax and completely biased against working people and in favour of wealthy everywhere else. And that's just not good enough in a country like Scotland, where inequality is taken seriously, even if it isn't in England and London in particular.
Yeah, Labour have gone on about, trying to improve the relationship with Scotland and vice versa, and, make devolution work better. But you've pointed out there one of the ways in which it certainly doesn't. And we'll hear more about the Scottish budget in the new year, so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. Just to go through some of the other headlines of the budget, Richard. There was a controversial proposal to raise salary sacrifice schemes. Salary sacrifice pension contributions above £2,000 a year will not be exempt from national insurance from April 2029. And there are fears this will impact on people's retirement savings. Richard, can you explain a little bit about this and how this might impact people?
As things stand, let's remember that national insurance is another of those taxes that is not devolved to Scotland. So the rules are being made by London. That's also unreasonable. I don't like national insurance. It's a ridiculous tax that we still have it. It's out of date and everything else. But as things stand at present, if you and your employer agree that instead of being paid 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, whatever it might be that you want to pay into your pension a year, then they can pay part of your salary into your pension, and you save national insurance on that contribution, and they save the employer's contribution, which means that they might be willing to put in some money as well, very importantly. And so you get a growing pension pot, and there's nothing wrong with having a growing pension pot. But Rachel Reeves has decided in her, I was going to say wisdom, but that would be vastly overstating what she is possessed of. So she has just decided to cut this, to limit that relief to £2,000 of income per year. And that will have real impact, because you are required in most employments to now make contributions to a pension scheme. And in many cases, this will begin to cut in, and there are a lot of people who are doing voluntary contributions where this will have an impact. But the daft thing about this, and let's be clear about this, the daft thing about this is it is deeply regressive, because it is going to hit those who make smaller contributions. And a £2,000 per annum pension contribution is not unusual for people who are on average pay. What she didn't do was remove the pension tax relief on people with higher pay, so that they only get the same amount of relief on income tax as do people on lower pay. £50,000 limit is really important here, where you move from the basic rate of income tax to the higher rate of income tax. And I know these bands are slightly different in Scotland, but not very much. And the point is that if you are a higher rate taxpayer, you get tax relief at your higher rate of tax. But that could be double the amount of subsidy you get from the government for your pension from what you would get if you are a basic rate taxpayer. And I can't see any justice in giving higher rates of subsidy to the already wealthy for their savings to make them wealthier still, but that's what the system does. So she hit people who are on the lowest rates of pension contribution with an additional tax, and she let those who are stuffing money away left, right and centre into their pensions to continue to do it willy-nilly as they want. And I just think that is absurd. She got everything wrong here. There's a bias to the wealth that runs through a lot of what she said in this budget.
No, thank you for that, Richard. I think another headline that caught people's eye was something that the Labour government appear to have been threatening for a while, which is that there will be a reduction in the cash ISA allowance. So at the moment, anybody can put up to £20,000 into a cash ISA. That's a tax-free allowance. But with this change that's coming in, £8,000 of that has to go into a stocks and shares ISA. This is all about investment, presumably, Richard. So Rachel Reeves, I'll read this to you, said the UK has some of the lowest levels of retail investment in the G7, and that it is that is not only bad for business who need that investment to grow, it's bad for savers too. Someone who has invested £1,000 a year in an average stocks and shares ISA every year since '99 would be £50,000 better off today than if they'd put that money into a cash ISA. This is what Rachel Reeves has said. But experts have said that the announcement will not necessarily persuade people to move their money into investments. What do you think about this, Richard?
Well, the first thing to say is that Rachel Reeves does not understand savings and investment. First of all, actually, banks don't need cash deposits to be able to lend money, because despite the fact that most people think that banks lend out the money that is deposited with them by savers, they don't. It's technically impossible. They owe that money back to you, so they can't give it to somebody else. It's yours. Secondly, there actually is no money in a bank, by the way. It's just a number printed on a balance on your account, and there is nothing backing it up at all, which again, most people find shocking. But so cash in a bank is problematic. I don't know many people who can afford to put £20,000 a year into their savings. Maybe you do. I don't. But that aside, there's also the problem with all the logic that is implicit in what she said about putting money into shares. First of all, if you read the Financial Times at present, you don't just have to read me on this, read the Financial Times, and you will discover plenty of people saying stock markets are heavily overvalued at the moment. If you buy shares at the present, according to some commentators in the Financial Times, you can expect to lose 40% on them in the next year because they're expecting there to be a stock market crash. I do think that is going to happen. But she wants to force you to put money into there, and that's what she's trying to make you do. It's folly. Secondly, there is no relationship at all between putting money into an ISA that invests in shares and investment in British business. And let me make clear why. I'm going to use one of those sort of headline company names. Marks and Spencer's has been around forever. I can remember getting lost in there at the age of 3 or 4, and I'm sure kids of the age of 3 or 4 still are, but I'm talking about 63 years ago. And the fact is that Marks and Spencer's does not issue new shares to fund its investments, and nor do the vast majority of companies ever issue shares to fund investments now, because they don't need to, because they can borrow money easily and more cheaply and with greater tax relief from the financial markets than they can by issuing shares. So this idea that buying shares funds investments is one of those words that I like. It's crap. It's a completely rubbish approximation to the truth, as I describe crap in economics terms. And you don't. You buy second-hand shares. The share already exists. There is no new money goes to the company. You just pay the person who previously owned it. And because of that, this idea that somehow she thinks she's going to put more money into investment because she's encouraging people to buy stocks and shares ISAs is just, well, the clearest indication that she has no idea how the world works. But the whole of this budget is the clearest indication of that. She does not understand the economy we live in. And the whole of the City of London is about speculation. It's not about value creation. It's not about investment. It's about taking people's savings, creaming a bit off the top for all the financiers involved, and frankly paying us poor rates of returns and delivering no benefits for society. But let me be clear, we subsidize as a nation, as the UK as a whole, pension and ISA saving by £80 billion a year. 80 billion. That's enough to pay for every primary school and most of the university sector in the whole of the UK. And yet they take that as a subsidy for savings and they don't deliver decent returns with it. We just live in a bonkers system where we claim the high priests of the free market system should be able to claim the greatest degree of subsidy for any business sector right across the UK as a whole. And apparently that proves what great believers in neoliberal economics they are. It's all a load of rubbish. It's bonkers. It's madness. And we need to sort this out.
Well,
should I offer you an opinion? Should I get off the fence and perhaps say something which offers an opinion next time?
Well, I think the next thing we need to discuss is at least a little bit positive. That is the removal of the two-child benefit cap. This was introduced by the Conservative government in 2017, and it has meant that parents can only claim universal credit or tax credits for their first two children. It is being removed in April, which is great news, but there have been huge calls for Rachel Reeves to do this since Labour came into government. They've held on to a damaging Tory policy for 16 months. Charities have said stopping it is absolutely key to driving down child poverty, and they've waited all this time, and people are still going to have to wait another 6 months for it. Labour MPs have been suspended over calling for this to be abolished so far up until now. So, Richard, I'm sure you'll welcome this news, but you have to question why this has taken so long, don't you?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I like to blame Rishi Sunak for things, and this one I think we can blame on Philip Hammond, probably. I suspect most people can't remember who Philip Hammond was. But he was the Tory Chancellor when this was introduced, and it's utterly iniquitous. I mean, it's just horrendous that we actually decided that children were of unequal worth, and if your parents happen to have 3 children, and I'm one of 3. And let's just point out the fact that my parents never planned to have 3 in all probability, but numbers 2 and 3 arrived as a job lot. We're twins, in other words. But that would have meant that my parents would have lost out under this rule. And how unfair would that have been when the child wasn't even planned but happened? And how many other children are born in the world who weren't planned but happened, but are then subject to a penalty? This has at its core the idea that the feckless poor should be punished. That is what this Tory logic was. The first thing that Labour should have announced on July the 5th, 2024, was that they were going to abolish this rule, but instead she reinforced it. And when Labour MPs opposed, 7 of them were suspended. Absolutely unbelievably, they were suspended from the Labour Party for caring about children and people in poverty, which just showed where Rachel Reeves stood and how absolutely out of touch again with reality she is. Now it's going under pressure from a lot of people, and yesterday Labour MPs waved their order papers in great excitement about this. But why, when we've waited too long for it to happen, I don't know. Why they think this is so wonderful when actually some of their colleagues were suspended because of it, I don't know. The stain will stick on Labour because of this, let's be clear. It shows where they really stand. Of course, this policy was something that Scotland was trying to do something different with. So there will now be 200 million released into the Scottish budget because, in fact, that was being set aside to deal with this problem inside the SNP's budgeting figures. That won't be necessary now, so great. Shonna's now got another 200 million she can think about what to spend, which is good news for Scotland. But it just shows that at least Scotland was aware of these issues, whilst the Labour Party was not. I mean, it just stacks up the case against Labour in Scotland for me. It stacks up the case for being against Labour everywhere for me, I'm afraid. I have no faith in this party anymore, if I ever had any. Their continual disappointment and their bias to the rich and against the poor, to me, is just totally unacceptable. So it's good news it's gone, but it should never have been there from the day after Labour came into office in 2024. And that's what I take up from this.
Yeah, it's interesting, Richard, how you say that it will remain a stain on them. It just goes to show that this is kind of maybe a too little, too late policy from their point of view, even though it is good news. And it does say a lot, doesn't it, that the Scottish government were planning to mitigate that cap, and now, funnily enough, Labour have got rid of it. Just to move on to a slightly different subject, Richard, I think this is very important for Scotland. The UK government has raised alcohol duty again, at a time when the whisky industry is really struggling. Many distilleries have already had to lay off staff and cut back production because of previous duty rises. I think there's been something like 3 duty rises in the last 2 years. Also, things like the hike to employers' national insurance contributions haven't helped in that regard either. So the previous 3.65% increase to duty has reduced spirits revenue by 7%, which is a loss of £150 million to the Treasury. So can you get your head around this, Richard? Because this isn't working, is it? The Treasury is sort of losing money out of this, and it's not good for the industry either. So what's going on here?
I think we have to look at this at several levels. My suspicion is that reduced consumption of whiskey is not just about duties. There is strong evidence that young people just aren't drinking anymore. When I was young, alcohol was the normal social lubricant. I know that some other substances might be for some young people now in a way that was not so common when I was young, and I was young a while ago. So I know that there's a major change in behavior, and I don't think we can ignore that. I do also think we need to take into account the fact that, frankly, for many people, whiskey is a luxury product, and they haven't got the money to spend on what is a luxury product, and in particular, the best products. And I'm ranking Scottish whiskey as the best. And so we do have to recognise that the problems the industry is facing are not just because of duties. And then we have the health issue, and they do actually want to impose extra duties, not because they necessarily need to. The amounts of money in question are pretty irrelevant. Let's be blunt. Overall, this is one of the sweating the small stuff moments in the grand scheme of the budget. Whiskey could have been exempted from these charges, etc. But they're not being, because there is a health agenda about this, and I think that is why it's continuing. How does Scotland adjust? Well, one, it has to be allowed to, of course, focus more strongly on the export market, which mysteriously is apparently it's British whiskey when it leaves Scotland, which I always find very bizarre and rather offensive. And it has to make perhaps more exclusive products. I mean, I just read in the last week in the National about this quadruple distilled whiskey, which sounds quite amazing. I think it was Laura Pollock who actually did the review of it and said it blew her every flavor around her mouth apart. And I thought that sounds fascinating. But maybe we have to look at whiskey in a different way in Scotland. We have to look at it actually as a luxury product to some degree and build it in that way for that market, where you don't actually go out for a session where whiskey is going to be a part of it, but you drink it as something which is very expensive, but reserved for the special occasion on. And so I think the industry has a duty to respond. I think that's because of that background. The big problem for the industry is that young people aren't drinking. And some people can't afford to drink. And it's not duty per se that is the problem. I get the issue, and lobby by all means to have the duties changed and maybe reduced. But the big challenge is to actually work out how to create value which people will pay for. And I think whiskey can do that, because I think whiskey can be the most amazing thing to drink with the most amazing flavors. But it's got to be innovated to achieve that outcome. So I haven't got a clear answer here, because I think there's too many issues involved. And I don't claim to be an expert on all those interactions. But this is one where tax is not probably the biggest problem.
No, thank you for taking us through all that, Richard. There are a number of issues at play, as you say, so no, thanks for doing that. I think my final question, Richard, is that Stephen Flynn, the SNP's Westminster leader, said yesterday that this will be the last budget for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. Something, of course, that he probably would say, but would you agree with that? Do you think that this budget was bad enough that we might not see another one from these two?
I did actually wonder whether Rachel Reeves would be able to get a budget through Parliament. So bad is the sentiment amongst Labour MPs and peers. And I do have contact with quite a number of them, and I hear what they're really thinking. And I appreciate that fact, but I'm not going to name them for obvious reasons, because you don't. But the fact is that there are a lot of them who are very angry with Starmer and Reeves, and for good reason. Let's be blunt, they have failed them. Well, I do think that this budget was only terrible and not dire. And as a consequence of it being only terrible and not dire, she will survive for the time being. Is Stephen Flynn right? Yeah, I'm pretty sure he is right. But the reason why he's right is that Scotland is going to give Labour a drumming next May. England is going to do the same thing. Different elections, council elections in England, the elections for Holyrood in Scotland, and of course the Senedd elections in Wales. And Labour is going to see its fortunes just disappear. It's standing at 18% in national opinion polls now, behind the Tories, equal to the Greens, and of course way behind Reform. And it is fading away fast. Labour is, frankly, in my opinion, over. It last had a major crisis, a complete meltdown in 1931, of course, after the crash of 1929 and the creation of the national government. if we do have the financial crash that I do honestly still think is going to happen, because AI shares are still heavily overvalued and stock markets are too high, and none of that is allowed for, of course, in Rachel Reeves' budget, and she has no plans in place to deal with it, and I don't think she'd have a clue how to deal with it. Unlike Ingrid, to give him credit, or both of them credit, in fact, two Scotsmen who were Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, who did manage the 2008 crisis quite well. Much as I didn't like everything else they did manage that crisis quite well. I don't think Rachel Reeves will know how to do that. So the combination of what I expect is a financial crisis, a meltdown, and the electoral meltdown that is going to happen in Scotland and Wales and England in separate elections next May means, no, I don't think that Rachel Reeves is going to be at the dispatch box next October or November or whenever we have another budget. And nor do I think Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister by then. Their day is done. The stopgap team put in place by Morgan McSweeney, the person who fancies himself as the great guru of modern Labour, who selected them for office, will have failed miserably. I hope McSweeney goes as well. But will Labour recover from this? No, I don't think so. I think Labour is history. I think we're looking at a new political settlement now. In Scotland, it is clear the SNP has been given a lifeline which a little while ago it didn't expect to have. We can expect to have a significantly more vibrant economic debate about what the future of Scotland will look like. And I welcome that, because I don't think it should just be about the SNP. We do, of course, have reform to fear. The Tories are as dead as Labour is. And at a national level, look, let's get out as soon as possible, because Nigel Farage isn't the person that anybody wants as a prime minister anywhere. And maybe he won't be. We are, however, in a period of enormous flux. The Chinese curse is, may you live in interesting times. It is a curse. We are living in interesting times. We don't know what the outcome will be. But I can be pretty sure that for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, the backbenches and retirement are looming. And I think both of them have probably done enough to secure themselves jobs in the city. And I suspect that was always the career plan.
Well, the elections next year in Scotland, Wales, and in the council elections in England are certainly going to be interesting. And it does, as you say, look as if the Labour are not going to do very well at all in any of them. So thank you so much, Richard, for being with us today and explaining all the important bits of the budget. It's been great to have you. And thank you all for joining us, and join us next time.